Hi, everybody, welcome to the Language Worker. Let's talk about terminology. Surprise, surprise, right? So, this series is obviously dedicated to terminology because I thought it was time for me to talk about the real love of my life. You can say that, if you can say that, definitely the first love of my life. The whole reason why I entered into the language adventure had to do with terminology, believe it or not, right? So, this is the real deal. This is what I love the most. This is something that's always been present in my life, and it's something that I love talking about. So it's only fair to myself that I should, and everybody else, that I should do a bit of a series about terminology. So today we're going to talk about a thing that people ask me a lot about. So it's governance, right? Terminology governance. I just find this word so far-fetched, right? Because it can be applied to one glossary or to a whole corporation of the size of Apple, right? Or Microsoft, right? So I did work for Microsoft as what they called at the time a language moderator, but it really meant translation or terminology manager because that's what I did. I was like the person in the middle trying to get everybody's consensus and ideas and suggestions and validating and working my way out of all the trouble that one can get into when having terminology discussions, right? So that's what I did. So that's governance, I suppose, when it's a huge corporation and all of that. But it's also governance when you're trying to manage your glossary that you did for your own thing if you're a freelancer, for example, right? So but the word is huge, and to be honest, I'd rather use the word ownership, right? I'm really a fan of this word compared to governance just because I think it makes it more real, right? I think governance is such an abstract concept, or it's more complicated to grasp. So, on saying that, uh, most of all workflows or plans or terminology projects start with a glossary, right? So this this is also a concept that can tell you all sorts of things or nothing at all. Some people consider that just a list of possible keywords that's present in a text is a glossary. And the truth is that it is a glossary, right? Or if you find a list of a bilingual list of terms, one in one language, the other one in the target language, that's a glossary. Yes, that's true. That's a glossary too, right? So basically, the glossary itself can be just a list of words that have some logic behind it. Usually, it's part of a text or a whole work of art, or a document, a manual. It can be anything, or it can be really something with a lot of information that can serve multiple purposes. I'm obviously a fan of that. I love glossaries that have a lot of information, are very rich, because then you can do with them whatever you need to do with them, and you don't ever need to start from scratch. So if all that you have is a glossary, great, you've started, right? So this is a great starting point. It's the starting point, even if then you take it further in whatever direction, right? Unless you already have, your corporation already has one of those big TMSs, what we call terminology management systems, then you usually have a glossary, right? But if you have multiple departments, if you have multiple projects, if you have multiple clients, then it's pretty complicated to work with one glossary only. So, what's the story with this glossary? What's in there, right? What kind of content do you have there? Is it just that? One of the things that I get a lot is when people ask me to look at their glossaries, they will have a list of the supposed approved terms that they already decided are going to be, the ones that are going to go everywhere, travel with your product or service, your texts in general, your communication. And then there's usually a list of maybes. Is this maybe the right term? Is this appropriate? Is this what we used last time? And then there's a list of whatever else. Right? So, is this the right translation? Did we use this before? Is this possible? Is this even correct? So it's very interesting, right? So I'd say if that's the case, and usually is if there's nobody who is responsible, like the owner of the glossary, let's call it that, then it's going to be impossible to actually to keep a clean and very functional glossary for a long time, right? So this is why I say that ownership is one of those concepts that needs to be present if you're going to have terminology management or terminology workflow, or both, ideally, right? So, what should happen? What should happen is that if you have that one or multiple documents or Excel sheets, whatever you use, that works okay, I suppose, as a starting point. Then what you have to do is actually to consolidate, to clean, and to create some sort of way of harmonizing all the content that you already have there. So someone needs to be responsible for this cleanup, right? If you're a freelancer, if you work by yourself, you will know the history on how this glossary is created, if you created it yourself, or if you've had a relationship for a long time with a certain client, or you've had contact with their content for a long time, you will know this, like a bit of history. But if this is the first time that you're looking at this thing, right, you probably need assistance, you need help. This is why I also say that one of the things that we should do is to document our rationale, right? The way we come up with the idea of including each one of the entries in a glossary. And I'll say entries right now because some of the entries in a glossary are not necessarily terminology, right? They are other linguistic or not. Sometimes even images can be in a glossary, right? There are other elements that convey meaning, but they're not necessarily terms in the classic sense, which means that they would be the jargon, the specific specialized words used for a certain science or object, something that is strictly related to that. And it's not other things that we also need to find in a glossary in the case of people who work in the language services area, right? We usually need other elements. They're not only the technical terms used in that science or domain or vertical. Right. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to consolidate whatever information we have and actually clean out, because that's one of the other things that I see. I see super extensive glossaries where some of the words actually are pretty common sense, right? So they have pretty well established equivalents, if we're talking about a more technical thing, or a translation, right? So these are well established, and maybe these glossaries came from a time where this area was not as mainstream and these were still a bit opaque, let's say. So this is the first thing that this owner needs to do, because there has to be some documentation, some history to actually understand what is going on there and how these entries came about, how they came to be part of this glossary. So this is the very first step, to find out who the person is who can be responsible to actually harmonize whatever information is there. Then, unless you work solo and you created the glossaries because you wanted to make your work easier, if you're part of a team and if this glossary is going to be used by other people, we cannot forget that this ownership needs to be shared, and that's for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that that person can just go away and then you're as lost as you were before, right? So ideally this person is responsible, but there are other, let's call them stakeholders, right? Other people who have to be responsible for this glossary, because if you have more than that, more than a freelance practice, you cannot sustain a glossary by yourself. You can manage a group of people. You can be the go-to person to make sure that this has one structure and goes into one direction, but you cannot expect one person to be responsible for the terminology, for the workflow, for the management of all words, expressions, brands, all sorts of things that need to be in this glossary. So we have to remember that if it's one person or if it's one team, they have to collaborate with everybody else. They have to have the ability, the visibility, and the knowledge to go to the right people for the right task. So a glossary, ideally, is not a one man or woman job. So it's something that needs to be done by a group of people who are not only using the knowledge that they have, that it's super valuable, but also getting this ownership idea. You cannot implement terminology or whatever it is in your company without making it part of a culture. People have to somehow understand why this glossary exists, the benefits, and their role in it. So they have to own it too. This is why I call it ownership a lot more than governance, because governance is in another stage, right? I think that if we get to the ownership part, then it's much easier to get to the governance part, right? Let's go with the ownership and with the conscious that it's a team effort. A lot of people have to be involved, or else it will not work. It could actually harm the whole workflow if things are decided one way one day and another way another day, right? So the idea is to make this into a team effort that will benefit the whole team, the whole company, the brand, and brand visibility. So I'll see you next week with a little bit more about my favorite topic, and that's terminology. Let me know if you're enjoying the series. Leave me your comments, your questions. I'll be happy to talk about this always, right? Thank you so much. See you next week.